Buongiorno tutti, sono Francesca Elisabetta. Good morning, I am Francesca Elisabetta, and today I want to talk about intergenerational trauma. It's a word I heard about in Italy quite a few years ago, and I wasn't really sure of the significance or the value of the word, but as I've gone forward quite a few years. So if we go back to when I had the stroke and the embolism in the eye was 2012, I had met somebody who was right below a doctor level in the hospital checking my eye because while I was waiting for my second heart surgery that I didn't know I was going to have, and I was having AFib, I shot out an embolism which hit my left eye and ruptured, damaged my optic nerve, leaving me with 3 scotoma blind spots, and then shingles took over because I'm immune compromised, and it affected both of my eyes in terms of vision. So I have good days and bad days. I have time within the days that I have good vision and bad vision, and it's a moving target. Glasses cannot fix this. So this particular nurse doctor, but she was more than a nurse, less than a doctor, started telling me about 7 generations of sins that her priest in Italy was teaching her about. And sorry, I've got asthma, so I get a little cough this morning. I don't know if there's something in the air lately. But she started trying to tell me that what had happened to me with my health was the price I was paying for the sins of my family going back up to 7 years. So, I try to be open-minded. I try to hear people out. I try to process it. And to me, I just wanted her to get through the eye exam to identify why I had lost my vision in my left eye. But I remember her talking about it, and I think that was 2012, and this is now 2023. That was the first time I had heard this kind of concept. But that was her priest's interpretation through the extreme Catholic Church in Italy. Okay, so let's put that aside. As we've gone forward, I started hearing more about intergenerational trauma. And, if this is you and something happened to your grandmother tells your mother tells you, I could see how that happens. But what they're saying is, in reality, you can have things that come down more generations than that. And that's where they kind of sometimes talk about wives' tales or stories. And so the truth was, I had heard stories from my father of an incident in Ireland where one of his ancestors got in a riot or a fight and supposedly threw a rock and hit somebody in the head. I don't remember the details of what happened to the person, but the person was injured and injured significantly enough that there then became a price on this male's head for him to get out of the country. And when I've gone back into the archives on my father, I did actually, yeah, right. He also said we were half Welsh and half Irish. And Owens is a Welsh name. But when I went into the archives, I could see how many people were born in the United States. And the 4 people that left Europe, that came to America, that ultimately mated, married, had kids, and created my father's bloodline, they had all left Ireland. Nobody was from Wales. So I had talked to a young man on a plane and asked him, why would my dad be so adamant about this, carrying the story of you're Welsh, you're Welsh, you're Welsh? And I've also done the 23andMe DNA testing, and I find the pockets of where the people are, but I actually found more Scotland than Wales. And so this young man explained to me that there was a certain time that one of the queens of England had made a call out to the men that were Scottish and Welsh to leave their homelands, go over to Ireland, take an Irish bride, marry the Irish bride, impregnate the Irish bride, and convert her to our religions away from being a Catholic. And what he said is that these men all did this, but in reality, the women were stronger than the men emotionally, and the children were still raised Irish. Nothing had changed. So the only thing that these men had left was to tell the story that you come from this Welsh bloodline, and it was such a huge issue because the children took on the mother's religion, and they didn't get to do exactly what the queen wanted to do because the men ended up subduing to the women. So part of it is my dad's story of what I told, part of it is what I researched, and part is what this Irish kid explained to me, why it makes sense that I would understand this all to have happened. Now we're going to switch over to my mother's side. So my mother was 100% Italian. She was born to two Italian immigrants who left San Giorgio Liri and Caserta. My grandfather left in 1916 and my grandmother left in 1920. She was the youngest of four children. Her brother Francesco had already left and moved to the United States in Connecticut. And my grandmother Antonia remained by her mother's bedside until her mother died. My grandmother was 20 when her mother died. And, it's funny, my grandmother never mentioned her mother. It's just kind of weird. It's kind of like my mother never mentioned her father either, except for very, very little. I don't know what that's about. That must have been something that was kind of taught. So my grandmother came over in the bottom of a boat leaving Naples. My grandmother had believed that she had left from France. So when I interviewed my grandmother, and I've got the audio recording of my grandmother, and I've got the Ellis Island archives, and I've got the family in Italy, and I've got the family photographs, and I have some genealogists in my family, I was able to fill it in to make it a very tight story. So intergenerational trauma. My mother would repeat to me that my grandmother repeated to her. Don't ever leave your daughters with a man who is drunk or has been drinking. Doesn't matter if it's a brother, a father, an uncle, a priest, doesn't matter who it is. If the man has been drinking, do not trust that man with your daughters. So whatever my grandmother saw or experienced or had repeated to her from her mother, she had told my mother this because my mother had 5 daughters and my dad was an alcoholic. So my mom, even though my dad had never done any inappropriate conduct like that, he was a violent alcoholic, but he never had any sexual indiscretions that I ever saw at all. The story got repeated to me, and then I repeat it to my daughters. And then maybe at some point in time, if I live long enough, my granddaughter might hear it. So you've got my grandmother, my mother, me, my daughters, and potentially my granddaughter. Right there is 5 generations. Either my grandmother knew this experience, or she had heard the experience, or she was told by her mother, which means you now throw on another generation and you now have 6 generations. So even though I'm not aware of, from adulthood, I'm not aware of my mother and myself ever being sexually abused, and in any severe way. A lot of girls have a lot of things happen, and there was a few things, but not anything that I'm going to say was severe. I don't really know what the story was with my grandmother, but that message got continued down, as far as that would be some type of intergenerational trauma that was passed on for quite a few generations. My grandmother also came in on the bottom of the boat, the steerage, I think it's called, and she was convinced she was leaving from Paris. Well, when I did, because everyone spoke French and she just knew she traveled, to her it was Paris. So I went and did the boat archives and found out she left from Naples, and Naples is not very far from San Giorgio Liri. It's the region right below us, but you figure in 1920 the form of transportation was really limited. They didn't have cars. I don't even know what the train structure would have been look like, because the trains were all blown up during World War II, and I don't really know how much the trains were beforehand. So you don't know how she got down there. She could have been on a wagon and a horse being pulled with other immigrants. And when she got on the boat, everybody spoke French. They were put down in the bottom. They had bunk beds. They had pails for peeing, pooping, and vomiting in down below. There were hundreds of them. There were no windows. There was no fresh air. And they took the voyage over in the steerage of the bottom of the boat. And that incident probably would have been her first time getting on the boat, but she said she would never, ever, ever, ever get on a boat again after this incident. because it was so traumatic. Because one of her sons had a boat and we would go out in Long Island, but my grandmother would never go out because she was against boats because it was so bad. Another story is my aunt would tell me that my grandfather, who died before I was born, would not allow my grandmother to make potatoes. Our house, my grandmother's house, potatoes were forbidden while he was alive. He died young. He died before my mother got married, so she was about 21, 22. And then later on, my grandmother did make potatoes. And I also had heard stories that he had been hit by mustard gas in the war and had a twitch, and he was a shoe cobbler. And as he repaired shoes, the women would come in the Bronx, and sometimes he would twitch, and they assumed he was winking, and so he kind of got in trouble because he couldn't really speak a lot of English. He could speak English, but they just assumed he was flirting, when in reality, he was a war hero from World War I. He entered World War I voluntarily to earn his American citizenship. He fought alongside Alvin York, which was the hero of World War I, in a different platoon, but in the same, I don't have the right word, but right company, but a different platoon. One was A and one was G. 10,000 men entered the war and only 3,000 came out. And my grandfather was one of the 3,000. And he earned his citizenship that way. Now, while the war was happening during the winter months in France, and my grandfather was a farmer from Italy, the homeland, they didn't have enough food to eat for the soldiers. And my grandfather was able to figure out where that was potatoes frozen under the ground, and he would dig out the potatoes and eat raw, frozen, unwashed potatoes. And my grandfather, from what I found him in a world history book, that he's a hero in World War I, he was hit by shrapnel and gas and was taken out of France, and it has the date, the location, and you can go back and you know it was winter. So now you understand why that is another intergenerational story. So you've got my grandfather, my mother, me, my daughters, and then my granddaughter. And the truth is I've written a children's book, illustrated a children's book that talks about my grandmother's voyage, my grandfather in the war, and it talks about my granddaughter's family in Indonesia. And I've had the chance to meet my granddaughter's family from the bloodlines of Indonesia and interview them and include their story in this book. So those are examples of intergenerational trauma. Now, what I think the movie Another Self kind of does is it has these characters kind of picking up the vibes and reading the vibes of the other people, the primary person that's in question. And they pick up the vibes, they read the vibes, and then they reenact it. And then this person goes back to their family members that they can find to find out what is the truth, what happened. And when they go back to their family members, they end up finding that these visions that these people at this encounter had told them were all true and really happened. And then they start to understand why their own parents were quirky and their own parents had issues, because you could be carrying generations of trauma. So it's a really interesting movie. It's a fantastic movie. And I think the topic is really relevant because there's so many issues in every family that this is the story that we get told. And I don't think we should hide from these stories. I think it's wisdom and enlightening to know these stories, to understand part of the reason why people can be this way. I know of another family member, not my family, but a girlfriend who there was sexual incest from her brothers. And it was a huge secret that she had carried. And it's only as an adult woman has she started to come out with the story to her daughter. And my guess is her grandchildren will end up finding out. I have another girlfriend whose mother was extremely, extremely religious in her older years, to only find out that in her younger years, the mother was having an affair. And my girlfriend is not the blood child of the father, that she was raised to believe. She was the youngest of 6 kids, and she's not even her father's kid. And the contradiction of what the woman, the mother, would have done to be having the affair, get pregnant, have the baby, that years later she must have carried a lot of guilt about this secret, and therefore turned to religion and became overly religious, overly judgmental, overly things like that. So a lot of times you might just look at the face value of somebody and not understand exactly why they are the way they are. But in reality, there is stuff that they may know about and they don't know about, but they've been told about, or they've been reprimanded about. Like, supposedly my mom said my dad was a womanizer when he was young, and something about picking up girls and doing some kind of sexual activity with them and then kicking them out of the car and leaving them to walk home, which is really horrible. And then he goes to have 5 daughters. And so my dad was always hyper vigilant to make sure that he didn't want men or boys near his daughters, because he knew what he had done. So anyway, it's all food for thought. And sometimes if you think you've got some quirkiness, or someone in your family's got quirkiness going back generations, there's probably some type of intergenerational trauma you've not been told. Watch the Another Self. It's on Netflix. I'm going to clean my glasses here. Excellent film. If it shows up language that they're speaking in Turkish, go down to audio. And in audio, they'll initially show you the subtitles, hit subtitle English, but then go down to the audio part of the subtitles and put it in English. And it is dubbed in English, so you can hear it in English. Very good movie. Okay, bye, you guys.